The winter of 1822 came to Harrowmere not as weather, but as a policy. It did not arrive on a wind or announce itself with snow against the tall leaded windows. It settled instead into the gray stone of the great house as a debt settles into a family, quietly, permanently, and with the patience of something that knows it will be paid. The cold in that house was not an accident of the season. It was a decision, made each morning at the housekeeper's desk with a ledger open and a stub of pencil, and it was measured out in coal, as a miser measures out coins, grain by grain, hearth by hearth, until only the rooms that mattered to the family that mattered were permitted the dignity of a flame. Harrowmere had been built to be warm. That was the cruel irony of it, the thing a stranger felt before he understood it. The hall was cavernous, its ceiling lost in a dark high up where the candlelight could not reach, and along its length stood fireplaces so vast a grown man might have stood inside one without stooping. They had been raised by people who believed a great house should hold the winter out at the door and never once let it pass the threshold. But those who had built that belief were long in the ground, and the people who owned Harrowmere now believed something else entirely. They held that warmth, like everything else, should follow the blood. The senior branch of the family kept the east wing, where the fires were fed morning and night and the rooms smelled of beeswax and roasting. The poorer branch, the cousins who had come to Harrowmere when there was nowhere else on earth for them to go, were given the north rooms, where the damp lived in the walls and the cold came up through the flagstones into the soles of the feet, and where a fire was a thing you were reminded, gently and often, that you had not paid for. Into this house, into its measured cold and its careful cruelties, had come a girl named Eleanor Vane, and she had arrived as the poor always arrive at the houses of their rich relations, which is to say, with gratitude she was expected to show, and grief she was expected to hide. She was 23 that winter. Her mother had been a Harrowmere by birth and a disappointment by marriage, having chosen a clergyman with more conscience than living, and when both her parents were carried off within a single hard season, Eleanor was sent to the great house of her mother's people to be, as the letter had put it, of use. She understood what of use meant. She had understood it from the first hour. It meant she would not sit at the family table, and she would not be presented, and she would wear the gray wool dress she had brought with her, mended at the elbow and turned once already, until it fell from her shoulders in rags. Gray was the color they had assigned her, and gray she wore, and she came in time to think of it not as a color at all, but as a kind of survival, the plumage of a creature that lives by not being seen. She was not beautiful as the house prized beauty. Her cousin Cordelia, whom the senior branch had borne, was beautiful in that fashion, all pale gold hair and a laugh that could be heard from 2 rooms distant, and Cordelia had been raised to believe that a room only truly began when she entered it. Eleanor was brown-haired and quiet and quick, with hands that had learned to be useful and eyes that had learned to notice, and she had the particular dignity of a person who has decided, somewhere in a cold night, that no house will make her small even when it has made her poor. She did not weep where anyone could see her. She made no complaint. She met the small daily cruelties of Harrowmere as a stone meets rain, and if it cost her something, she did not tell the house what it cost. There was one duty at Harrowmere that no one else wanted, and so it had fallen to Eleanor, and she had taken it as she took everything, without argument and without show. In the great hall, at the northern end where the family seldom passed, stood the oldest of all the fireplaces, a black mouth of stone taller than she was, and it was the one fire in all of Harrowmere permitted to burn through the night. The reason given was practical, and like most practical reasons, it hid a colder one. The old master of the house, the grandfather who now rarely left his rooms, had ruled long ago that a single hearth must never be let to die. For a house whose every fire has gone out is a house that has admitted it is finished, and he would not admit it, not even to himself, not even in the dark. So one fire was kept, and keeping it night upon night, through the small hours when the rest of the household slept warm or slept cold according to their blood, was Eleanor's task alone. She did not mind it as much as they supposed she would. There was a peace in that northern hall after dark which the daylight house did not allow her. When the family had gone up and the candles were snuffed and the vast dark folded down from the invisible ceiling, the hall belonged, for a few hours, to her and to the fire. She came to know the fire as a shepherd comes to know his flock. She learned which logs would spit and which would sulk, how to bank the coals so they would hold their heart until dawn, how to lay the kindling so a tired flame would catch again without waking. She kept a poker and a small brush and a folded cloth, and she kept her sleeves pushed up past the elbow, and more nights than not she wore a smudge of ash high on one cheek where she had pushed the hair from her eyes with the back of a suited hand. She had no idea those first months that she made a picture there, kneeling small and careful before that enormous cold stone, coaxing one stubborn light to stay alive in a house that had decided warmth was not for the likes of her. She knew only the work, and she did it well, because doing a thing well was the last country she still owned. That was Harrowmere when the gentleman came down the first night. And it is worth saying plainly before the story goes on that Eleanor had no notion who he was, and would not learn for a long while, and that the not knowing was the whole shape of what happened between them. He came down late, well past the hour the family kept, when Eleanor had settled the fire for the night and drawn the low stool near it to warm her hands before the long walk to the cold north room where she slept. She heard him before she saw him, that particular quality of a footstep on stone which belongs to a man who is in no hurry and answers to no one, and she rose at once and stood aside with her hands folded and her eyes down, because so a girl in gray behaved when her betters walked abroad. She expected to be sent away. Instead, the footsteps came to the far side of the hearth and stopped, and there was the small groaning creak of the great carved chair that no one ever sat in being drawn a few inches nearer the fire, and then the sound of a man sitting down in it, and then nothing at all. She waited to be dismissed. She was not dismissed. She waited to be spoken to. She was not spoken to. The gentleman sat in the firelight, with his long legs stretched toward the flames and his hands loose on the arms of the chair, and he looked at the fire much as she sometimes looked at it herself, as though it were the only honest thing in the room. He was perhaps 35, dark-haired, with a face that had been handsome before something taught it to be still, and he wore dark plain clothes that were good without being showy, the clothes of a man who did not need anyone at Harrowmere to be impressed by him. In the shifting light she could not place him. He was not one of the senior branch, whose faces she knew and avoided. He was not any of the guests she had glimpsed. He was simply a cold, quiet gentleman who had come down to sit by the one fire in the house, and who did not seem to mind or even to notice that a servant girl in gray stood in the shadows, not knowing whether to stay or go. At last, because standing was no answer and fleeing would have been a rudeness, she lowered herself again to her stool at the edge of the hearth and returned her attention to the fire, feeding it a single split log so it would not gutter in the draught, and she made herself as small and as unremarkable as the andirons. The gentleman said nothing. The fire burned. Somewhere far off in the sleeping house a clock counted out the quarter hour and let it go. And after a time, a long time, The gentleman rose as quietly as he had come, and crossed the dark hall, and went back up the way he had descended, and Eleanor was left alone with the flames and a bewilderment she could not name. She thought that would be the end of it. A gentleman may sit where he likes in his own relation's house, and a servant does not ask why. But the next night he came again, at the same late hour, and again he drew the great chair a little nearer the warmth, and sat. And again he said not a word, and again he watched the fire as though it owed him an answer. And the night after that he came a third time, and Eleanor Vane, who had learned to expect nothing from that house and to be grateful for less, found that she had begun, without meaning to expect him. She could not have told anyone why she was not more afraid. A poor girl alone with a strange man in a dark hall had every reason to be afraid, and she was no fool. But there was something in how he sat that put her at her ease, a stillness that asked nothing of her, a silence that did not feel like judgment. Most of the people at Harrowmere, when they looked at her at all, looked at her as a sum, as a thing that cost the house a little and returned a little, and their eyes moved past her the moment the small arithmetic was done. This gentleman did not do that. When his gaze rested on her, and once or twice across those first nights it did not weigh her worth or measure her use. It simply saw that she was there, a person keeping a fire, and let her be a person. She had gone so long unseen that being merely seen, without judgment and without demand, was very nearly the kindest thing that had happened to her under that roof. So the nights went on, and a strange companionship grew between them that was made entirely of silence. He would come, she would feed the fire, the flames would rise and fall, and neither of them would speak. She came to know the rhythm of him as she had come to know the rhythm of the fire. She learned that he descended later on the nights the family had entertained, and that on those nights he sat longer and more heavily, as though the evening had cost him something. She learned that he liked the fire, built high and clean, and though he never asked for it, she found herself building it so, and telling herself it was only good practice. And once, on a bitter night when the wind found every gap in the old leaded glass and the flames leaned and shuddered, she reached for the poker at the same moment his eye went to the fire, and she caught, before he mastered it, the smallest movement at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, the ghost of the memory of a smile, gone before she could be sure she had seen it at all. His name was a blank to her. His business was a blank to her. She had no inkling that in the daylight house, in the rooms she was not permitted to enter, a quiet and terrible reckoning was gathering, and that the still gentleman who joined her at the fire each night was at the very center of it. She knew only the fire and the silence, and the strange truth she would not have said aloud even to herself, which was that the coldest house she had ever lived in had become, for 1 hour of each long night, a place she did not entirely dread. The daylight house, meanwhile, went on as it always had, and the daylight house had a great deal to say about the gentleman, though none of it reached the northern hall where Eleanor kept her fire. In the warm east wing there was a name spoken now that had not been uttered in that house for the better part of 10 years, and it was spoken carefully, as people speak of a debt they had hoped was forgiven and have just learned is not. The quiet stranger had come to Harrowmere on the last coach of an autumn evening, unannounced, with a single trunk and a manner that gave nothing away, and he had asked for rooms in the old wing rather than the fine ones, and he had said, when the senior branch pressed him, only that he wished to look at the house before certain matters were settled. Certain matters. The phrase had gone through the east wing like a draft through a door. For the senior branch of the family knew, as Eleanor did not, exactly who he was and exactly what his coming meant, and it frightened them. And a frightened cruelty is the worst kind there is. Eleanor felt the change in the house before she understood it, as an animal feels weather. The small economies grew smaller and sharper. The housekeeper's temper shortened. Cordelia, who had never in her life needed a reason to be unkind, found new ones, and took to passing through the great hall in the late afternoon expressly, it seemed, to remark on the state of the girl who tended it. On one such afternoon she stopped, where Eleanor knelt clearing the grate for the evening, and she looked down at her the long moment that pretty people reserve for plain ones. "It is a wonder the family keeps you at all," Cordelia said, "a great gray mouse forever scrabbling at the ashes. If you had a grain of proper feeling, you would understand that you are a charity, and comport yourself accordingly, and be seen a good deal less." Eleanor did not answer at once. She finished setting the log she was laying, and she brushed the ash from her hands against her apron, and she rose. Because a thing said standing is answered better than a thing said kneeling. She did not raise her voice. "I am glad to be of use to the family," she said, "and I will try to give less offense. I hope the room is warm enough for you, cousin. I saw the fire in the small parlor had been let to sink." It was said so gently that it took Cordelia a moment to understand that she had been reminded, without a single sharp word, which of the two of them actually knew how to keep a house from freezing. Cordelia's color rose. She said something about impertinence, and swept out, and the sound of her going was louder than her coming. And Eleanor knelt again and finished her work, and if her hands trembled a little, she did not let them tremble for long. She had learned that the only revenge available to the poor is to be, quietly and unmistakably, better at the thing that matters than the people who despise them for doing it. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that the whole of that exchange had been heard. The gentleman had come down early that evening, sooner than his custom, and had stopped in the shadow of the great screen at the hall's end when he heard voices, and had stood there unseen through the length of it, from the great gray mouse to the sunken parlor fire, and he had watched a girl in a mended gray dress answer a cruelty that would have flattened a lesser soul with nothing more than a plain truth and a kept temper. He did not step forward. It was not yet the hour to step forward, and he was a man who had learned patience in a hard school. But something settled in him that evening as he stood behind the screen. Some judgment that had been forming for weeks and now had its final proof. And when at last Cordelia was gone and the girl was alone again with the fire, he came out of the shadow as though he had only just that moment arrived, and took his chair and watched the flames and said nothing. And Eleanor never suspected that he had seen her tested and had seen her hold. The winter deepened, and though not a word passed between them that could have been called a conversation, the silence itself began to change, to warm, to become less like the silence of strangers and more like the silence of two people who have learned they need not perform for one another. Eleanor began, in small ways she scarcely noticed herself doing, to make the hour easier for him. On the nights he came down looking worn, she built the fire warmer and set the great chair a hand's breadth nearer without being asked. She learned to have the hearth already burning bright when he arrived, so that he need not sit into the slow climb of a new-laid flame, but might come at once into the good heart of it. She said nothing of any of this, and neither did he. But a house is warmed by more than coal, and the northern hall of Heir, which the family had abandoned to the cold on purpose, became by imperceptible degrees the one warm room in it, kept alive by a girl who had nothing, and a man the girl could not name. He began, over those weeks to speak. Not much, and never of himself, but a word here, a word there, dropped into the silence like a coin into deep water. He asked her once, watching her bank the coals where she had learned to do it so. "My father taught me," she said. "A clergyman's house is always cold and always full. Keeping a fire alive on nothing was the first skill I was ever proud of." He was quiet a while after that. Another night he remarked, almost to himself, that most people fed a fire as they gave charity, all at once and for show, and let it burn to nothing the moment their backs were turned, and that it took a rarer sort of person to keep a thing alive when no one was watching and no one would thank you for it. Eleanor understood, or thought she understood, that he was speaking of fires. She did not understand that he was speaking of her, and of a whole household, and of a thing that had happened long ago in that very hall, and she went on feeding the flames, and did not know that she had just been paid the highest compliment the still gentleman had given anyone in 10 years. There was one night that stayed with her longer than the others, though nothing much happened in it, which is often true of the nights that stay. The frost had come down hard and early, and the great hall was so cold that even the fire seemed to labor against it, and Eleanor had knelt long past her usual hour coaxing the flame to hold, her breath showing pale in the firelight and her fingers stiff on the poker. The gentleman had come down and sat, and watched her work, and after a while he had risen without a word, and taken up a fold of the coarse wool that hung by the hearth for the sweeping of ash, and laid it across her shoulders where she knelt, and sat down again as though he had done nothing at all. It was the smallest thing. It was a servant's rough cloth, not a fine shawl, and he had not so much as looked at her while he did it. But no one at Harrowmere had troubled to notice that she was cold in 4 winters, and that a cold and silent gentleman she did not know should notice it and mind it, and do the one small plain thing to mend it, undid something in her that all the open cruelties of the house had never managed to touch. She kept her face to the fire so he would not see. He kept his to the fire so she would not have to. And the flame between them burned a little steadier for the two of them tending it, and neither said a word, and it was, she thought afterward, the nearest thing to tenderness she had known since her father died. It was on such a night, when the frost had drawn ferns across the tall windows and the whole house lay under a silence so complete she could hear the coals shift, that she asked him at last the only question she ever put to him. She did not ask his name. Something told her the name was not hers to ask for. She asked, instead and softly, why he came down, why a gentleman with a warm room of his own and a whole east wing of fires should come each night to sit in a cold hall beside the one hearth a servant kept. He did not answer for a long while, and she thought she had presumed too far and bent again to her work. Then he said, still looking at the fire and not at her, "In all the years I have known this house there has been exactly one honest warmth in it. When a man has been cold a long time, he learns to go and sit beside the only fire that was ever lit for its own sake, and not for show." And he rose, before she could ask what he meant, and crossed the hall, and went up, and left her kneeling in the firelight with his words turning over and over in her mind like a stone she could not put down. The truth of the gentleman, which Eleanor did not possess, and which the family guarded like a wound, was older than her coming to Harrowmere, and colder than any of its winters. The house did not belong, by right, to the branch that ruled it. It had belonged to another man entirely, the eldest son of the old master, and that son had married against his father's wishes a woman the family judged beneath them, and for that offense he and his had been slowly, patiently frozen out, given the north rooms and the sunken fires and the daily reminders that warmth followed the blood and their blood had thinned. It was into that cold that the eldest son's own child had been born. A dark and watchful boy who grew up in the north wing of Harrowmere, learning, winter by winter, exactly what it meant to be family and yet be left to freeze. His mother had perished of the damp in one of those north rooms, while the east wing dined warm. His father had followed her not many years after, worn thin, and the boy, when he was old enough, had gone away from Harrowmere and sworn never to come back, and the ruling cousins had told themselves comfortably that the troublesome line was ended and the house was theirs. They had been wrong. The boy had gone to sea, and then into trade, and then into the sort of quiet fortune built by someone who has learned young that no one will keep him warm, and he had better learn to do it himself. And in the fullness of time, by the plain workings of law and death and entail, the whole of Harrowmere had come to him. He was the heir. He was, in every particular that a court of law would recognize, the true owner of the house that had left his mother to die of its cold. And he had come back, at last, not in triumph and not in vengeance, but quietly, in plain clothes, arriving after dark on a late autumn coach, to look with his own eyes at the household that had frozen him out before he decided what to do with it. Certain matters, he had said, would be settled. The senior branch, who owed him everything and had given his mother nothing, understood at last the size of the debt, and they were afraid. This was the man who came down, night upon night, to Eleanor's fire. He had not sought her out. He had come, the first night, to the one warm hearth in a house of deliberate cold, because the North Hall had been the country of his boyhood, and its cold was the cold he knew. And he had found kneeling before that fire a gray-clad girl in a mended dress doing, without complaint and without an audience, the very thing the whole house had once refused to do for his mother, which was to keep a warmth alive for someone the family had decided did not deserve it. He had watched her for weeks, as a man watches to be sure of a thing before he trusts it, and he had seen her cruelly used and had seen her answer cruelty with dignity. And slowly, against every guard he had built in a hard life, the coldest man at Harrowmere came to understand that the one soul in that entire house he did not despise was the servant girl who did not know his name. The senior branch, feeling the ground shift beneath them and not yet knowing by what exact degree, did what frightened cruelty always does, which is to look about for someone weaker to punish. And their eye fell, as it was always going to fall, on Eleanor. It had not escaped Cordelia, who missed very little that touched her own consequence, that the quiet gentleman whose favor might mean everything to the family's fortunes went nowhere in the evenings but down to the cold North Hall, and that he stayed there, and that the only person he could possibly be going to see was the gray little mouse who tended the fire. The thought was intolerable to Cordelia in a manner she could not quite have explained, for she did not want the still gentleman herself so much as she could not endure that anyone might prefer a servant to her, and out of that particular meanness a plan was made. If the girl were the reason he came down, then the girl would be removed, and disgraced in the removing, so whatever strange notion he had formed of her would be poisoned at the root. It was done with the ease that the powerful always have in the ruining of the powerless. A small brooch of the senior branches, a thing of gold and garnet that Cordelia wore often, was found to be missing, and it was remembered, loudly and in front of the assembled household, that the gray girl had been seen near the east wing, and it was suggested, and then asserted, and then treated as established, that a charity relation with nothing of her own might well have been tempted, that such people always were, that it was only to be expected. Eleanor was called before the family in the great hall on a gray afternoon, made to stand on the cold flagstones while the senior branch sat, and accused to her face of theft, and told that she would be turned out of Harrowmere that same day, into the winter, without a character, so that no other house would ever take her. She did not weep, though the cold of it went through her worse than any winter. She stood very straight on the flagstones with her reddened hands folded before her and her chin level. "I did not take the brooch," she said. "I have never in my life taken a thing that was not mine. You may search the whole of my small store of belongings, and you will find nothing, because there is nothing to find." Her voice was not loud. It carried, though, in that great cold hall, with the particular carrying quality of the plain truth spoken by someone who has nothing left to lose but the truth. Cordelia laughed and said the girl would say so, wouldn't she? And the housekeeper looked at the floor, and the senior branch, who did not care in the least whether the girl was guilty and only cared that she be gone, prepared to have her put out of the door. And it was into that moment, into the very center of that cold hall, while a poor girl stood accused on the flagstones, and the family that meant to ruin her sat in judgment, that the still gentleman came down the great staircase unhurried in his plain dark clothes, and stopped where they could all see him. "What exactly," he asked, in a voice as quiet as ever, and twice as cold, "is being done in my house?" There was a silence in the hall then of a kind Eleanor had never heard, a silence with a weight to it, and she saw the faces of the senior branch change in a manner beyond her reckoning, saw the color drain from Cordelia's cheek and the housekeeper's hand go to her throat, saw the old certainties of that room come apart in the space of a single held breath. She did not understand it, because she alone did not grasp the meaning of the two words the gentleman had spoken. My house. The others knew. The others had known for weeks, and had chosen to gamble that his strange notion of a servant girl would not survive her disgrace. And now they watched their gamble turned over in front of them, and they had nothing to say. The old master, who had not left his rooms in a season, had been brought down that afternoon to preside over the girl's dismissal, and it was to him the gentleman turned first, and something in the younger man's stillness made the old man look very old indeed. "I have been in the house some weeks now," the gentleman said, "and I have looked, as I came to look, at how the household conducts itself. I have seen a good deal. I have seen a great cold house that feeds its fires by blood and lets the rest freeze, and I have better reason to remember such a house than any of you might suppose." And then he said his mother's name. He said it quietly, into the cold hall, the name of the woman who had died of the damp in a north room while the east wing dined warm. And at the sound of it the old master's face broke, because the old master had been the one who ruled that warmth should follow the blood, and he understood at last who had come back to Harrowmere in plain clothes on the last coach of an autumn evening. The gentleman let the name stand in the air a moment. "I am that woman's son," he said, "and this house's heir, and its master now in law and in fact. I did not come home to be revenged upon anyone, for revenge is only the cold returning the cold. I came to see with my own eyes whether the house that froze my mother out had learned anything at all in the years since it killed her." He paused. "And I have my answer. I watched you, this very hour, prepare to turn a girl into the winter without a character, on evidence you had not troubled to find, for no crime but that she is poor and inconvenient, and was kind to a man you did not know was worth being kind to. It is the very same coldness, wearing the very same face, that put my mother in the ground." Cordelia found her voice, because people like Cordelia always find their voice a moment too late. "She is a thief," she said, with the shrillness of the cornered. "The brooch is gone." Whatever you have decided about your precious mother, the fact of the theft remains. The gentleman looked at her the long, level look that she had so often turned on Eleanor, and it was a colder thing on his face than it had ever been on hers. "Where was the Brooke last seen?" he asked mildly. "Who reported it missing? Did anyone search for it, or was it more convenient to have it lost?" And then, before Cordelia could gather an answer, he told her that he had taken the liberty, being master of the house, of having the matter looked into properly that very morning, when he first heard the accusation being readied. For he had learned long ago that a charge laid against the poor is worth investigating precisely because so few ever trouble to. And he nodded to the doorway, and the old man-servant who had served the north wing in his boyhood came forward and laid upon the table, in front of them all, the garnet brooch, which had been found not among Eleanor's poor belongings at all, but at the back of a drawer in Cordelia's own dressing-room, wrapped in a handkerchief marked with Cordelia's own initials, exactly where a careless girl leaves a thing she has misplaced and then finds it useful to call stolen. The hall was very quiet. Eleanor stood on the flagstones and felt the cold go out of her all at once and something else come in, and she did not yet trust it. For she had learned in that house that hope was a thing they took from you the moment you showed you had it. But the gentleman was not finished. He turned from Cordelia, who had nothing left to say and knew it, and he crossed the hall, past the seated family, past the housekeeper, until he stood before the girl in the mended gray dress on the cold stones. And for the first time in all those winter nights, he looked at her not across a fire, but full in the face. And the whole assembled household saw the master of Heir stand before a servant girl, as though she were the only person in the room worth standing before. "I came home meaning to weigh this house," he said, "so that all of them could hear it, and to decide what was worth keeping in it. And I found, kneeling before the one fire the house would let her keep, the only warmth in Heir that was ever true. Everything else here is warmth by blood and warmth for show, coal spent to prove a family's consequence, and it has all left me as cold as it left my mother. But that fire in the North Hall, kept alive night after night by a girl who owns nothing and is thanked by no one, and had every reason to let it die, that is the one warmth in the house lit for its own sake, for the plain human refusal to let a light go out. It drew me down out of the cold every night, because it was the only honest thing under this roof." His voice did not rise. "I have watched her tested, and I have watched her hold. I heard her answer cruelty with dignity when she thought no one was listening. One who has spent his life learning to keep himself warm knows the difference, always between a fire lit for show and a fire lit because it is right." And then, before the whole of the family that had frozen them both, he said the thing plainly, so there could be no mistaking it and no taking it back. "I have a great cold house to make into a home," he said, "and I cannot do it with people who measure warmth by blood. So I have made my choice. I will not keep the branch that killed my mother by inches and that has this very hour tried to turn an innocent girl out into the winter." He looked at Eleanor then, there on the flagstones, with the ash still on her hands and the whole cruel household as his witness. "And I will keep you. Stay at Heir, not as a servant to tend one fire in the cold, but as its mistress, to help me teach this whole house at last what warmth is for. I have chosen you," he said, and the word fell into that hall like a coal into deep water, over the family, over the blood, over everything this place taught me to believe I was owed. In all of Heir you are the only one who ever kept a fire lit for no reason but kindness, and a man who has been cold his whole life knows, when at last he finds it, exactly where the warmth is. Eleanor did not answer at once, and the hall held its breath through the silence, and she let it. She had stood accused on those flagstones not a quarter hour before, and she was not a woman to be swept off her feet by the sudden turning of a great wheel, for she had learned too well what it cost to hope. She looked at the man before her, the still gentleman of all those winter nights, and she understood a great many things at once. The name he had spoken, and the mother who had died of the cold, and the boy who had learned in the north rooms exactly what she herself had learned, that a house can decide you do not deserve to be warm and can go on deciding it for years. She understood why he had come down to her fire. She understood, too, that a woman may be given everything at a stroke and still lose herself in the taking, if she takes it only because it is offered and not because she wills it. And so when she answered him, she answered as herself, plainly, in the voice that had carried the truth across that cold hall. "I did not keep the fire for you," she said, and her voice did not shake, nor for anyone. "I kept it because a fire ought to be kept, and because I will not let a light go out for want of tending, not in this house, nor in any other. I have asked nothing of Heir, and expected nothing, and I will not now take a great house and a great name merely because they are held out to me by a man who has been kind, for a woman who is given everything at a stroke may lose herself in the taking." She paused, and the cold hall leaned in to hear it. "But in all the cold of this place there has been 1 hour of each night that I did not dread, and it has been the hour you came down. I learned in those silences that a person may be seen, truly seen, and not judged for it, and I did not know before how much I had wanted that, nor how long I had gone without it. If you ask me to stay because you pity me, then I must say no. But if you ask me because you have chosen it, and because I choose it too, then yes. Yes, with my whole heart." She put her suited hand into his, there on the flagstones before them all, and she chose him as plainly as he had chosen her. And the choosing was the warmest thing that Hall had felt in 100 years. He closed his hand over her ash-marked fingers as though they were the finest thing in the house, and he did not care in the least who saw him do it. And for the first time in 10 years the still gentleman of Heir smiled a smile that reached his eyes. What became of the rest of them may be told quickly, for cruelty makes a dull story once it has lost its power to frighten. The senior branch left Heir before the month was out, for the master would not keep them, though he did not turn them into the winter as they had meant to turn Eleanor, for he had spoken the truth when he said revenge was only the cold returning the cold, and he wanted no more of the cold. He settled upon them a modest sum, enough that no one could say the heir of Heir had let his own blood starve, and rather less than they had grown used to spending, and he sent them to a smaller house in a duller county where fires were a thing one counted. Cordelia, who had believed to the last that her beauty was a kind of fortune that could not be spent, married in time a gentleman of means twice her age, who valued her precisely as an ornament, and warmed her exactly as much as it pleased him to, which was to say, on the days he remembered she was there. She had wanted a warm house all her life, and had thought warmth was a thing you were owed by blood or bought with a pretty face, and she went to her grave never once understanding why the fires in her own rooms always seemed to sink the moment her back was turned. The old master lived out his last winter in the warm east wing after all, for Eleanor would not have him put from it, and it was Eleanor herself who saw that his fire was kept, and the old man, who had ruled long ago that warmth must follow the blood, died at last in a warmth that followed no blood at all, but only the kindness of the girl he had once let stand accused on his cold flagstones, and if he grasped the lesson of that at the end he never said. But he wept once when she banked his coals for the night, and turned his face to the wall. A year and a little more went by at Harrowmere, and the house was not the house it had been. The change did not come all at once, for a great house learns slowly, but it came. The fires were lit now in every wing, morning and night, not because blood demanded it, but because the master had ruled that no soul under his roof, from the highest guest to the lowest scullery girl, should ever again be made to learn what it was to freeze in a house that could have warmed them. The servants who had watched a girl in gray become the mistress of the place found that she had not forgotten a single one of their names, nor the exact particular cold of the north rooms where she had once slept. And those north rooms were the first she saw made warm. The great hall at the northern end, with its black stone mouth of a fireplace taller than a woman, was kept burning bright now, not through a servant's lonely vigil, but as the warm heart of a living house. And it was there, more evenings than not, that the master and his wife sat together in the firelight, in 2 chairs drawn near, and often as not said nothing at all, for they had learned long ago in that very spot that the best silences need no filling. There was a child by then, a dark and watchful little thing with its mother's quick eyes. One winter evening, kneeling on the flagstones before the great hearth to be at the child's height, a thing no one who had known him in the cold years would have believed him capable of, the master showed the little one how the coals were banked to hold their heart until morning, exactly as a clergyman had once shown a girl in a cold house long ago. "Slow," he said, laying the child's small hand over his own on the poker. "You do not feed a fire all at once. You give it only what it can hold, and then you leave it be, and it keeps through the night." "Why does it have to keep all night?" the child asked. "Because," said Eleanor from her chair, "a house where every fire has gone out is a house that has given up, and we do not give up in this house. Not one hearth, not one soul is left to the cold here. Ask your father why." The master did not look up from the coals. "Because someone once kept a light lit for me," he said, "when there was no reason on earth to trouble, and no thanks in it. I mean for you to know how it is done." And Eleanor, watching them from her chair with the firelight moving warm across the stone that had once been the coldest place she knew, understood that the poker and the ash and the lonely nights had not been the end of her story after all, but only the keeping of a small light through a long dark, until the dark was over. The theme of it, if a story of a cold house and a kept fire has a theme, is only this, and Eleanor had known it long before the great house learned it. A home is not the place that keeps its own warm and lets the rest freeze, for that is merely a house with a good fire and a hard heart, but the place that will not let a single light go out for want of tending, even the light it has been told is no one's and worth no one's trouble. She had kept such a light through the coldest winter of her life, alone for nothing, because it was right, and it had warmed in the end far more than the one hearth it was lit upon. It had warmed the whole of Harrowmere. It had warmed the cold man who came down each night to sit beside it. And it had, at the very last, warmed the girl who kept it, which is a thing that kindness does when no one is looking, though it never once promises it and never asks a thing in return. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of the story of the girl who kept the fires lit, and of the cold gentleman who came down each night and turned out to be the heir, and who chose her. If it warmed you even a little on a cold evening, we would love to know. Please tell us in the comments which city you are listening from tonight, and what this story made you feel. And if you would like to sit beside more fires like this one, do subscribe to the channel so you will not miss the stories still to come. Until then, keep your own small lights burning and be well.